Marcus Sullivan had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Navy SEAL before retiring to the quiet coastal town of Millfield. His weathered hands bore scars from countless missions, and his steel-gray eyes held memories that most people could never imagine. At 42, he had traded his combat boots for work boots, opening a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. The transition from elite warrior to small-town mechanic wasn't easy, but Marcus found peace in the simple rhythm of fixing engines and changing oil. His greatest pride wasn't any medal or commendation he'd earned overseas. It was his 17-year-old daughter, Emma. She had her mother's bright smile and Marcus's stubborn determination. Emma was everything good that had come from his brief marriage to Sarah, who had passed away from cancer when Emma was only 8. Since then, it had been just the two of them against the world. Emma excelled at Millfield High School, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while playing on the varsity volleyball team. She had dreams of studying marine biology at Stanford, following her fascination with ocean life that had started during childhood trips to the nearby coast. Marcus worked extra hours at the shop to save money for her college fund, never complaining about the long days or aching back. Every sacrifice was worth it to see Emma's face light up when she talked about her future. The trouble began on a crisp October morning when Emma walked into Jefferson's department store, the largest retailer in Millfield. She needed to buy a dress for the upcoming homecoming dance. Emma had saved money from her part-time job at the local library, carefully counting every dollar to afford something special. The store was owned by the Caldwell family, who had been the wealthiest and most influential people in town for 3 generations. Richard Caldwell Jr., known as Rick to his friends, was the 25-year-old heir to the family fortune. He had returned to Millfield after dropping out of college twice, much to his father's disappointment. Rick spent his days managing the store with an iron fist, treating employees and customers alike with disdain. His sense of entitlement was legendary around town, but most people tolerated his behavior because the Caldwells employed half the town and donated generously to local charities. Emma was browsing through the dress section when she accidentally bumped into a display rack while reaching for a blue dress on a high shelf. A few items fell to the floor, and she immediately began picking them up, apologizing profusely to the nearby sales associate. The associate, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson, smiled kindly and assured Emma that accidents happen. Rick Caldwell had been watching from across the store, his face darkening with anger. He strode over to Emma, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. Without warning, he grabbed her arm roughly and began shouting about clumsy customers and damaged merchandise. Emma tried to explain that she was picking everything up, but Rick's voice only grew louder and more hostile. Other customers stopped their shopping to stare at the commotion. Mrs. Patterson attempted to intervene, explaining that Emma was being helpful and responsible, but Rick turned his fury on her as well. He threatened to fire her if she didn't mind her own business. The older woman stepped back, fear evident in her eyes. She had worked at the store for 15 years and couldn't afford to lose her job. Emma's cheeks burned with embarrassment as Rick continued his tirade. She had never been spoken to so harshly by an adult outside of her own family, and even then, her father had never raised his voice to her in anger. The young girl's hands trembled as she placed the last fallen item back on the rack, wishing she could disappear into the floor. That's when Rick made his fatal mistake. In a moment of pure arrogance and entitled rage, he raised his hand and delivered a sharp slap across Emma's face. The sound echoed through the store like a gunshot. Emma's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from pain but from shock and humiliation. The store fell completely silent. Even Rick seemed momentarily stunned by his own actions, though his expression quickly hardened into defiant justification. Emma stood frozen for several seconds before gathering what remained of her dignity and walking quickly toward the exit. She left the dress she had planned to buy on the nearest counter, no longer caring about homecoming or anything else except getting away from the terrible scene. Mrs. Patterson watched helplessly as Emma disappeared through the automatic doors. Several customers shook their heads in disgust and began putting down their own intended purchases. One elderly man approached Rick and told him that his behavior was disgraceful, but Rick simply shrugged and walked back to his office as if nothing significant had happened. Emma drove home in her father's old pickup truck, the one he had taught her to drive in the empty parking lot behind his shop. Her cheeks still stung, but the emotional wounds cut much deeper. She had never experienced such unprovoked cruelty from a stranger. The teenage girl who had walked into the store that morning full of excitement about homecoming now felt small and powerless. She pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story house, the place where she had always felt completely safe and protected. Marcus had painted it yellow because Emma said it reminded her of sunshine. The small garden in front bloomed with the vegetables they grew together each summer. It was home in every sense of the word. But even here, Emma couldn't shake the memory of Rick's hand striking her face. Marcus was in the garage working on a neighbor's motorcycle when he heard the truck door slam harder than usual. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside to greet his daughter, expecting to hear about dress shopping and homecoming plans. Instead, he saw Emma walking quickly toward the house with her head down and her hand covering one side of her face. Something cold and deadly settled in Marcus's chest. Years of combat training had taught him to recognize danger and assess threats in seconds. The way Emma moved, the protective gesture with her hand, the tears he could see despite her efforts to hide them, it all painted a picture that made his blood run cold. He called her name softly, and she stopped walking but didn't turn around. Marcus approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, his voice gentle and controlled despite the storm building inside him. When Emma finally turned to face him, Marcus saw the red handprint on her cheek and felt something snap inside his chest. For a moment, the quiet suburban garage disappeared, replaced by memories of desert compounds and hostile territory where protecting the innocent was a matter of life and death. But this wasn't Afghanistan. This was his home, and someone had put their hands on his daughter. Emma tried to downplay what had happened, not wanting to worry her father or cause any trouble in their peaceful town. She knew how hard Marcus worked to fit in after his military service, how much he valued the quiet life they had built together. But Marcus could read people and situations with the precision of a trained professional. He saw past her brave front to the hurt and humiliation underneath. As Emma recounted the events at Jefferson's department store, Marcus listened without interruption. His face remained calm and composed, but his hands gradually clenched into fists. When she finished speaking, he knelt down and gently examined the mark on her cheek, his touch feather-light despite the fury burning in his eyes. Marcus had faced enemy fire, improvised explosive devices, and hostile interrogations without flinching. He had been trained to remain calm under the most extreme pressure. But seeing his innocent daughter hurt by some entitled brat's tantrum triggered something primal and protective that went beyond military training. This was a father's rage, pure and simple. He helped Emma inside the house and got her an ice pack for her cheek. Then he sat beside her on the living room couch, the same one where they watched movies together every Friday night, and asked her to tell him everything again. Emma repeated her story, and Marcus memorized every detail. The name Rick Caldwell burned itself into his memory like a target designation. After making sure Emma was comfortable and had everything she needed, Marcus excused himself to make some phone calls. He went to his small home office, the room where he paid bills, and kept Emma's school records and his own military memorabilia. On the wall hung his service medals and a photo of his old SEAL team, men who would drop everything and come running if he ever needed them. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. When his former teammate Jake Morrison answered, Marcus could hear the surprise in his voice. They exchanged brief pleasantries before Marcus explained the situation. Jake's response was immediate and predictable. He wanted to drive down from Portland that very night to help sort things out. Marcus appreciated the loyalty, but told Jake to hold off for now. This wasn't a military operation requiring multiple operators. This was a family matter that needed to be handled carefully and legally. But having Jake's offer of support reminded Marcus that he wasn't alone, even in civilian life. The brotherhood forged in combat didn't disappear just because they had traded uniforms for regular clothes. Next, Marcus called his lawyer, a sharp woman named Helen Rodriguez who had helped him with various business matters over the years. Helen listened to his account of the incident and immediately began discussing legal options. Assault charges, civil liability, emotional distress. The list of potential consequences for Rick Caldwell was extensive and serious. But Marcus wasn't thinking about lawsuits or court dates. He was thinking about justice and respect and making sure that entitled brat understood the magnitude of his mistake. There was a right way and a wrong way to handle this situation. And Marcus's military training had taught him the value of careful planning over rash action. He spent the evening researching the Caldwell family, learning about their business interests and local influence. Richard Caldwell Sr. owned not just the department store, but also several other businesses around town. The family donated to local politicians and served on various civic boards. They were accustomed to having their way and making problems disappear with money and influence. But Marcus Sullivan wasn't a problem that could be bought or intimidated. He was a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others and eliminating threats. And someone who hurt his daughter had just made themselves the biggest threat on his radar. As Emma slept upstairs, her cheek finally, free of swelling thanks to the ice pack, Marcus sat in his living room making plans. Tomorrow, he would pay a visit to Jefferson's department store. He would have a conversation with Rick Caldwell, man to man. And by the time that conversation was over, the spoiled rich boy would understand exactly what kind of mistake he had made. The night was quiet except for the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Marcus had always found that sound peaceful, a reminder of the natural world beyond human conflicts and petty cruelties. But tonight, it sounded like the approaching storm that would soon engulf the Caldwell family and change their lives forever. Marcus had learned patience during his years of military service. He knew how to wait for the perfect moment to strike, how to gather intelligence, and plan operations with meticulous care. Rick Caldwell thought he had slapped a defenseless teenager and gotten away with it. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a man trained to win wars. The first phase of Marcus's response would be subtle and measured. He would give the Caldwells a chance to do the right thing, to acknowledge their son's behavior, and make appropriate amends. Marcus believed in honor and giving people opportunities to correct their mistakes before escalating to more serious consequences. But if the Caldwells chose arrogance over accountability, if they tried to dismiss or cover up what Rick had done, then Marcus would show them why Navy SEALs were considered among the most dangerous men on Earth. Not through violence or illegal action, but through the systematic dismantling of everything they thought made them untouchable. As the first light of dawn crept through his bedroom window, Marcus Sullivan prepared for battle. But this wouldn't be fought with weapons or explosives. This would be fought with intelligence, determination, and the absolute certainty that no one hurts his daughter without facing consequences they never imagined possible. Marcus woke before dawn, as he had every day since basic training 24 years ago. His internal clock operated with military precision, requiring no alarm to rouse him at exactly 0500 hours. This morning felt different, though. The air seemed charged with electricity, like the moments before a lightning strike. Today, he would make his first move against the Caldwell family. Emma was still sleeping when Marcus prepared breakfast. He made her favorite blueberry pancakes, arranging them on the plate in the shape of a smiley face like he used to when she was little. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight, a purple reminder of yesterday's humiliation. Marcus studied his daughter's peaceful face and felt his resolve harden into something unbreakable. When Emma came downstairs, she found the pancakes waiting along with fresh orange juice and a small vase containing a single daisy from their garden. Marcus had left a note beside the plate. "You are braver and stronger than you know. Love, Dad." Emma read the note twice, feeling some of yesterday's hurt begin to heal. Marcus had already left for work by the time Emma finished breakfast. He wanted to establish his normal routine before making any moves against the Caldwells. The auto repair shop opened at 7, and Marcus spent the first 2 hours of his day completing routine maintenance on 3 vehicles. He worked with focused intensity, channeling his anger into productive action. At 9 o'clock sharp, Marcus locked up the shop and drove to Jefferson's department store. He had chosen this time deliberately, early enough that the store wouldn't be crowded, late enough that Rick Caldwell would be on duty. Marcus parked his truck in the far corner of the lot and observed the building for several minutes, noting security cameras, employee entrance locations, and customer traffic patterns. The store occupied a full city block in downtown Millfield, its brick facade, and large windows designed to project prosperity and permanence. A sign near the entrance proudly proclaimed, "Serving Millfield since 1962, along with the Caldwell family motto, "Quality, Service, Community." Marcus found the irony almost amusing. He entered through the main doors and walked slowly through the store, retracing Emma's path from the day before. The dress section was exactly as she had described it, a maze of racks and displays that could easily trip up an unsuspecting customer. Marcus noted the security camera positioned to cover this area and wondered if yesterday's incident had been recorded. Mrs. Patterson was working the morning shift, straightening merchandise and helping early customers. When she saw Marcus, her face immediately showed recognition and concern. She approached him cautiously, glancing around to make sure they weren't being observed by management. She spoke in a whisper, telling Marcus how sorry she felt about what happened to Emma. Mrs. Patterson described Rick's behavior as completely inappropriate and praised Emma for handling herself with such grace under terrible circumstances. She also mentioned that several customers had witnessed the incident and were equally appalled by what they saw. Marcus thanked Mrs. Patterson for her kindness and asked where he might find Rick Caldwell. She pointed toward the back of the store, where a glass-walled office overlooked the main sales floor. Through the windows, Marcus could see a young man with perfectly styled hair talking loudly into a phone, gesturing dramatically as he spoke. The office was elevated slightly above the sales floor, accessible by a short flight of stairs. Marcus climbed them slowly, his footsteps silent despite the metal construction. Years of tactical training had taught him how to move without making noise, how to approach a target undetected until the moment of contact. Rick was still on his phone call when Marcus knocked on the office door. Through the glass, Marcus could see expensive furniture, framed diplomas from schools Rick had never graduated from, and photographs of Rick with various local dignitaries. The desk was massive, clearly chosen to intimidate visitors and emphasize Rick's importance. Rick looked up from his phone call with obvious irritation. He covered the phone with one hand and shouted for Marcus to wait outside until he was finished with his important business call. Marcus stood perfectly still in the doorway, his gray eyes fixed on Rick's face with the intensity of a sniper acquiring a target. Something about Marcus's presence made Rick increasingly uncomfortable. The phone conversation, which had been animated and confident moments before, became stilted and distracted. Rick found himself stumbling over words and losing track of what he was saying. Finally, he ended the call abruptly and turned his attention to the stranger in his doorway. Marcus stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Rick remained seated behind his desk, trying to project authority and control despite the growing unease he felt looking at this weathered man with cold eyes. Rick's first words were a mistake. Instead of asking how he could help Marcus or inquiring about his business, Rick immediately launched into a complaint about people interrupting his important work. He demanded to know what Marcus wanted and made it clear that he didn't have time for trivial matters or customer complaints. Marcus introduced himself calmly and explained that he was Emma Sullivan's father. Rick's face showed a flicker of recognition, but no remorse or concern. Instead, he rolled his eyes and muttered something about that clumsy girl who had made a mess in his store the day before. This response told Marcus everything he needed to know about Rick Caldwell's character. There would be no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no attempt to make amends. Rick saw himself as the victim in yesterday's incident, inconvenienced by a teenage girl's clumsiness and forced to restore order to his establishment. Marcus asked Rick to describe what had happened the previous day. Rick's version of events painted him as a responsible manager dealing with a disruptive customer who had damaged merchandise and created a disturbance. He claimed Emma had been rude and defiant when confronted about her behavior, forcing him to take decisive action to maintain order. The lies rolled off Rick's tongue with practiced ease. He was clearly accustomed to rewriting reality to suit his purposes, confident that his family's influence would protect him from any consequences. Marcus listened without interruption, memorizing every false statement and self-serving distortion. When Rick finished his fictional account, Marcus asked a simple question: "Did you put your hands on my daughter?" Rick's response was immediate and defensive. He claimed he had only given Emma a light tap to get her attention, nothing more than any parent might do to discipline a misbehaving child. The word discipline hit Marcus like a physical blow. This entitled brat thought he had the right to discipline someone else's child, to lay hands on Emma, as if she belonged to him. Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, but years of training helped him maintain control. Marcus stood up slowly and walked around Rick's desk until he was standing directly beside the younger man's chair. Rick swiveled to face him, suddenly, aware that he was no longer separated by the protective barrier of his expensive furniture. For the first time since the conversation began, Rick looked genuinely nervous. Marcus spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute authority. He explained that Rick had committed assault against a minor, a serious crime that could result in jail time and criminal charges. He mentioned that several witnesses had seen the incident and that the store's own security cameras had likely recorded everything. Rick's face went pale as the legal implications began to sink in. He had never considered that slapping a customer might have serious consequences beyond a possible complaint to corporate headquarters. The idea that he could face criminal charges or civil liability had never occurred to him. But Marcus wasn't finished. He continued speaking in that same quiet, deadly voice, explaining that Emma was not just any teenager, but the daughter of a man trained in unconventional warfare and psychological operations. Rick was dealing with someone who had spent years hunting dangerous people in hostile territory, someone who knew how to destroy enemies completely and permanently. Rick tried to interrupt, claiming that Marcus was threatening him and that he would call security or the police. Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the office, but it was not a pleasant expression. He suggested that Rick should definitely call the police, since they would want to investigate yesterday's assault charge. The mention of assault charges made Rick panic. He began backtracking frantically, claiming that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding and that he never intended to hurt anyone. He offered to forget the entire incident if Marcus would just leave his office and stop making threats. Marcus corrected him gently. There had been no threats, only statements of fact. Rick had assaulted Emma, and that action would have consequences. The only question was whether those consequences would be handled privately between their families or publicly through the legal system. Rick seized on this apparent opportunity for a private resolution. He offered to compensate Emma for any distress she had suffered, suggesting that a few $100s would be more than generous for such a minor incident. Marcus watched with cold amusement as Rick revealed the full extent of his arrogance and stupidity. The offer of money was the final insult. Rick thought Emma's dignity and safety could be purchased like merchandise from his store shelves. He had no understanding of honor or respect or the sacred responsibility of protecting children from harm. Marcus realized that subtle approaches would be wasted on someone this fundamentally broken. Marcus leaned closer to Rick, close enough that the younger man could smell gun oil and motor grease on his clothes. He spoke directly into Rick's ear, his voice carrying the promise of destruction. He explained that Rick had exactly 48 hours to personally apologize to Emma and make appropriate amends for his behavior. If Rick failed to meet this deadline, Marcus would begin a campaign that would systematically destroy everything the Caldwell family had built over 3 generations. Their business empire, their social standing, their political influence, all of it would crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. Rick tried to laugh off these threats, claiming that his family was too powerful and well-connected to be hurt by some small-town mechanic. Marcus's response was to pull out his phone and show Rick a photograph. It was a picture of Richard Caldwell Sr. taken that morning as he left his private club, unaware that he was being observed and photographed. The message was clear. Marcus already had Rick's father under surveillance. The Sullivan family wasn't some random target that could be dismissed or ignored. They were dealing with a professional who had the skills and resources to make good on his promises. Rick's bravado crumbled as the reality of his situation became clear. He was no longer the predator, but the prey, stalked by someone infinitely more dangerous than anyone he had ever encountered. The comfortable world of privilege and protection that had sheltered him his entire life was suddenly revealed as an illusion. Marcus straightened up, walked toward the office door, pausing with his hand on the handle. He reminded Rick about the 48-hour deadline and suggested that he use that time wisely. A sincere apology and appropriate compensation might be enough to end this matter peacefully. But if Rick chose to hide behind his family's influence instead of taking responsibility for his actions, he would learn why Navy SEALs were considered the most elite warriors in the world. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Rick alone in his office with his racing thoughts and growing panic. Through the glass walls, he watched Marcus walk calmly through the store and disappear through the main entrance. Other customers and employees went about their business, completely unaware that a declaration of war had just been delivered in their midst. Rick reached for his phone to call his father, but his hands were shaking too badly to dial properly. The confident young man who had slapped a teenage girl less than 24 hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that actions have consequences and that some people are too dangerous to cross. Outside in the parking lot, Marcus sat in his truck for several minutes, processing what he had learned about Rick Caldwell. The young man was exactly what Marcus had expected: weak, entitled, and completely unprepared for real consequences. The question now was whether Rick would be smart enough to take the offered path to redemption or foolish enough to escalate the conflict. Marcus started his truck and drove back to his auto repair shop, where 3 customers were waiting for their scheduled appointments. He spent the rest of the day changing oil, replacing brake pads, and diagnosing engine problems, maintaining his normal routine while part of his mind planned contingencies for every possible response from the Caldwell family. That evening, Marcus sat with Emma as she worked on homework at the kitchen table. Her bruise was fading but still visible, a constant reminder of the injustice that demanded correction. Emma asked about his day, and Marcus simply said he had visited the store to discuss the incident with management. Emma looked worried, concerned that her father might have caused trouble for himself by confronting powerful people on her behalf. Marcus assured her that he had handled everything properly and legally, but that didn't ease the anxiety he saw in her eyes. She knew her father well enough to recognize when he was operating in what she called mission mode. As bedtime approached, Marcus tucked Emma in just as he had when she was little. He kissed her forehead and promised that no one would ever hurt her again without facing serious consequences. Emma hugged him tightly, drawing strength from her father's unshakable presence and absolute dedication to protecting her. Alone in his own room, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling and counting down the hours until Rick Caldwell's deadline expired. He hoped the young man would choose wisdom over pride, accountability over arrogance. But if Rick chose poorly, Marcus was prepared to show the Caldwell family what happened when they made an enemy of the wrong man. The clock on his nightstand ticked steadily toward tomorrow, each second bringing them closer to a reckoning that would change multiple lives forever. Rick Caldwell had 48 hours to save himself and his family from destruction. Marcus Sullivan was counting every minute. 47 hours and 36 minutes had passed since Marcus delivered his ultimatum to Rick Caldwell. No phone call had come. No apology had been offered. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing had been made. Rick had chosen pride over wisdom, arrogance over accountability. Now Marcus would show the Caldwell family what happened when they underestimated a Navy SEAL's determination to protect his daughter. Marcus spent the morning at his auto repair shop, but his mind was focused on the intelligence gathering he had conducted over the past 2 days. During his military service, he had learned that information was often more powerful than weapons. The right piece of intelligence at the right moment could topple governments or destroy terrorist networks. The Caldwell family's business empire would prove no more resilient than the enemy strongholds Marcus had helped eliminate overseas. His research had uncovered a web of financial irregularities, tax discrepancies, and regulatory violations that the Caldwells had managed to keep hidden through careful manipulation of local officials and strategic political donations. Marcus had copies of documents showing inflated insurance claims, questionable accounting practices, and several instances of discrimination in hiring and promotion that had been quietly settled out of court. But the most damaging information involved Richard Caldwell Sr.'s relationship with Mayor Patricia Hendricks and City Council Chairman Tom Bradley. Marcus had discovered a pattern of suspicious zoning decisions and permit approvals that had benefited Caldwell Properties while harming competitors. The paper trail suggested a level of corruption that would destroy multiple political careers if it became public. At exactly noon, Marcus received a phone call from Helen Rodriguez, his attorney. She informed him that the Caldwell family's lawyers had contacted her office that morning, not to discuss an apology or settlement, but to threaten legal action if Marcus continued to harass their client. The threat confirmed what Marcus already suspected. The Caldwells intended to use their influence and resources to make this problem disappear rather than address their son's criminal behavior. Helen asked Marcus how he wanted to proceed. She could file assault charges against Rick immediately, or they could pursue civil litigation for damages. Both options would take months or years to resolve and might not result in meaningful consequences for someone with the Caldwell family's resources and connections. Marcus thanked Helen for the update, but told her to hold off on any legal action for now. He had a more immediate and effective solution in mind. The Caldwells had chosen to play hardball, apparently forgetting that Marcus had been trained by the most elite military organization in the world. They were about to learn the difference between civilian lawyers and Navy SEAL psychological operations. That afternoon, Marcus made his first move. He contacted Jennifer Walsh, the investigative reporter for the Millfield Tribune who had been trying for years to expose corruption in local government. Marcus had read her articles and knew she was fearless, thorough, and committed to holding powerful people accountable for their actions. Jennifer met Marcus at a coffee shop on the other side of town, away from the prying eyes and listening ears that monitored most of Millfield's public spaces. Marcus presented her with a manila folder containing photocopies of the most damaging documents he had discovered. Jennifer's eyes widened as she reviewed evidence of bid rigging, permit fraud, and systematic corruption involving multiple city officials. The reporter asked Marcus why he was sharing this information with her. Marcus explained that his daughter had been assaulted by Rick Caldwell, and that the family was trying to use their influence to avoid accountability. Jennifer nodded knowingly. She had heard rumors about Rick's behavior for years, but had never found anyone willing to go on the record against such a powerful family. Marcus offered to serve as an anonymous source, providing additional documentation and testimony as needed. Jennifer agreed immediately, recognizing the potential for a story that could win awards and change the political landscape of their community. She promised to begin investigating immediately while protecting Marcus's identity until he was ready to go public. While Jennifer began her investigation, Marcus initiated the second phase of his campaign. He contacted the regional office of the Internal Revenue Service and requested a meeting with Agent Carol Kim, a forensic accountant who specialized in complex financial investigations. Marcus had served with Carol's brother in Afghanistan and knew she could be trusted to handle sensitive information properly. Agent Kim reviewed Marcus's financial evidence with professional interest. The pattern of suspicious transactions and questionable deductions suggested systematic tax fraud that could result in millions of dollars in penalties and potential criminal charges. She agreed to open a preliminary investigation, though she warned Marcus that such cases could take years to complete. Marcus assured Agent Kim that he wasn't looking for quick results, just thorough and complete justice. He provided her with additional documentation and contact information for potential witnesses who might be willing to cooperate with federal investigators. The foundation for the Caldwell family's destruction was being laid one careful brick at a time. The third phase of Marcus's plan targeted the Caldwell's social and political connections. He began reaching out to other families who had been harmed by Rick's behavior over the years, people who had been too intimidated or isolated to speak up before. Marcus offered them protection and support if they were willing to share their stories with journalists and law enforcement. Sarah Martinez contacted Marcus first. Her 15-year-old daughter had been subjected to inappropriate comments and unwanted touching by Rick during a job interview at Jefferson's department store 6 months earlier. Sarah had complained to the store manager, but was told that there must have been some misunderstanding. When she threatened to call the police, mysterious problems with her husband's small landscaping business suddenly began appearing: permit delays, inspection failures, and lost contracts that nearly bankrupted them. David Chin's story was similar. His teenage son had been falsely accused of shoplifting by Rick and subjected to humiliating treatment before being released without charges. When David complained to Richard Caldwell Sr., his family's dry cleaning business began facing unexpected health department violations and fire safety citations. The message was clear: challenge the Caldwells and face economic destruction. Marcus documented each story carefully, building a comprehensive picture of the Caldwell family's pattern of abuse and intimidation. He put these families in contact with Jennifer Walsh and provided them with legal support through Helen Rodriguez's office. What had started as an isolated incident involving Emma was revealed to be part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. By the end of the week, Marcus had assembled a coalition of victims and witnesses that would be impossible for the Caldwells to intimidate or silence. The network included parents, employees, competitors, and community leaders who had all suffered under the family's reign of entitlement and corruption. Each person had a piece of the larger puzzle that would ultimately bring down the Caldwell empire. Richard Caldwell Sr. began to sense that something was wrong when his usual political contacts stopped returning his phone calls. Mayor Hendricks canceled their weekly lunch meeting without explanation. City Council Chairman Bradley Suddenly became unavailable for the private discussions that had smoothed the way for profitable zoning decisions. The protective network that had sheltered the Caldwell family for decades was quietly distancing itself from potential scandal. Rick, meanwhile, had convinced himself that the threat from Marcus Sullivan had been neutralized by their lawyer's intimidation tactics. He continued his usual routine of managing the store with an iron fist and treating employees and customers with casual contempt. Rick had no idea that his every action was being documented by people who were no longer afraid to stand up to him. The first public blow landed on a Tuesday morning when Jennifer Walsh's investigation appeared on the front page of the Millfield Tribune. The headline read, "Corruption Probe Targets Local Business Empire," and the article detailed years of suspicious financial transactions and questionable political relationships. The story named no specific individuals, but provided enough information for informed readers to identify the Caldwell family as the primary subject of the investigation. Richard Caldwell Sr.'s phone began ringing before he finished reading the article. Political allies demanded explanations. Business partners expressed concern about their ongoing relationships. Bank officials requested meetings to discuss outstanding loans secured by properties whose values might have been artificially inflated through corrupt zoning decisions. The second blow came 3 days later when federal agents arrived at Jefferson's department store with search warrants for financial records dating back 7 years. Agent Carol Kim supervised the seizure of computers, filing cabinets, and boxes of documents while shocked employees and customers watched through the store's large windows. Local television crews captured every moment of the raid for the evening news. Rick Caldwell's arrogance finally cracked as he watched federal agents carrying away the records of his family's business empire. For the first time since slapping Emma Sullivan, he began to understand that his actions might have consequences beyond anything he had imagined. The protective bubble of wealth and influence that had surrounded him his entire life was dissolving before his eyes. The third blow targeted the family's social standing within the community. Emma's story became public when Jennifer Walsh published a follow-up article titled, "Local Teen Speaks Out Against Abuse." Emma had initially been reluctant to go public, but Marcus helped her understand that her courage could prevent other young people from suffering similar treatment. Emma's interview was compelling and heartbreaking. She described the humiliation of being slapped by an adult stranger while other customers watched in shock. She talked about the fear and embarrassment that had followed her home and made her question her own worth. Most importantly, she explained how her father's love and support had helped her find the strength to speak out against injustice. The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Parents who had been quietly concerned about their own children's safety at Jefferson's department store now felt empowered to share their own stories. Teachers, coaches, and community leaders publicly condemned Rick's behavior and called for accountability. The Caldwell family found themselves isolated and vilified by the same community they had once dominated. The final phase of Marcus's campaign began when the other families affected by Rick's behavior started filing their own complaints and lawsuits. Sarah Martinez pressed charges for sexual harassment of a minor. David Chun filed a civil rights lawsuit alleging discrimination and intimidation. Each new case brought additional media attention and public scrutiny to the Caldwell family's pattern of abusive behavior. Richard Caldwell Sr. made a desperate attempt to salvage his family's reputation by publicly announcing that Rick would undergo counseling and sensitivity training. He also pledged to donate $50,000 to local youth organizations as a gesture of goodwill. But the public relations effort was too little, too late. The damage to the family's reputation and business interests was already irreversible. Marcus watched these developments with professional satisfaction. Every element of his campaign was proceeding according to plan. The Caldwell family's empire was crumbling under the weight of their own corruption and arrogance, just as Marcus had promised. But he wasn't finished yet. The most important element of justice still needed to be delivered. On a quiet Thursday evening, Marcus received the phone call he had been expecting. Rick Caldwell's voice was barely recognizable. Gone was the arrogant bravado, replaced by desperate pleading. Rick begged Marcus to call off his campaign of destruction, offering any amount of money or any concession that might end their family's suffering. Marcus listened patiently to Rick's rambling apologies and frantic promises of reform. When the younger man finally exhausted himself, Marcus spoke quietly into the phone. He explained that the campaign would continue until Rick publicly took full responsibility for his actions and made appropriate amends to Emma and the other families he had harmed. Rick agreed immediately, promising to do whatever Marcus demanded. But Marcus wasn't finished. He explained that Rick would also resign from his position at the store and seek professional help for his behavioral problems. Any future incidents involving abuse or intimidation would result in the complete destruction of whatever remained of the Caldwell family's assets and reputation. The conversation ended with Rick sobbing into the phone, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake and the power of the man he had chosen to cross. Marcus felt no satisfaction in the younger man's breakdown, only the cold certainty that justice was finally being served. The next morning, Rick Caldwell appeared at Emma's school with a written apology and a cashier's check for $25,000 to be deposited in her college fund. He read his statement in front of the principal, several teachers, and a newspaper photographer, accepting full responsibility for his inappropriate behavior and expressing genuine remorse for the harm he had caused. Emma accepted the apology with grace and dignity that impressed everyone present. She thanked Rick for taking responsibility and expressed hope that he would use this experience to become a better person. Her mature response to such a difficult situation demonstrated the strength of character that Marcus had helped nurture over the years. That afternoon, Marcus received similar apologies and compensation on behalf of the other families Rick had harmed. Each gesture was documented by the media and witnessed by community leaders, creating a public record of accountability that would follow Rick for the rest of his life. The Caldwell family's business empire continued to unravel over the following months as federal investigations uncovered years of financial irregularities and corrupt practices. Richard Caldwell Sr. was forced to sell most of his properties to pay back taxes and legal fees. Several city officials resigned in disgrace when their relationships with the Caldwells became public knowledge. Rick Caldwell enrolled in an intensive therapy program and began working at a nonprofit organization that served underprivileged youth, trying to make amends for his past behavior through service to others. The transformation wasn't easy or immediate, but it represented the beginning of genuine accountability and personal growth. Marcus Sullivan returned to his quiet life as a small-town mechanic, satisfied that justice had been served and his daughter's dignity had been restored. But the message had been sent to anyone else who might consider harming innocent people. Some enemies are too dangerous to make, and some fathers will go to any length to protect their children. The story of Marcus Sullivan and the Caldwell family became legendary in Millfield, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked privilege and the power of one man's determination to seek justice. Emma grew up knowing that she was loved and protected by someone who would never allow her to be victimized or silenced. And in his workshop late at night, Marcus Sullivan continued to fix broken engines and prepare for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that he had honored his most sacred duty as a father, protecting his daughter from those who would do her harm. 6 months had passed since Rick Caldwell's public apology to Emma Sullivan, but The ripple effects of Marcus's methodical campaign continued to reshape Millfield in ways that nobody had anticipated. The quiet coastal town had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the price of silence in the face of injustice. Jefferson's department store still operated, but under new management and with a drastically reduced footprint. Richard Caldwell Sr. had been forced to sell 2/3 of his real estate holdings to cover federal tax penalties and legal settlements. The flagship store that had once dominated downtown Millfield now occupied only the ground floor of the building, with the upper levels converted to apartments for middle-income families. Marcus drove past the store each morning on his way to work, noting the changes with professional satisfaction. The ostentatious displays of wealth had been replaced by modest decorations that reflected the store's reduced circumstances. The staff, once terrorized by Rick's unpredictable rages, now worked in an environment where respect and professionalism were expected rather than optional. Emma had used her settlement money to establish a college scholarship fund for students who had overcome adversity in their pursuit of education. The Emma Sullivan Scholarship had already helped 3 graduating seniors attend universities they couldn't otherwise afford. Each recipient was required to write an essay about standing up to bullying or injustice, ensuring that Emma's experience would continue inspiring others long after she left for Stanford. The scholarship ceremony had been held at Millfield High School's gymnasium, with Marcus beaming proudly as Emma announced the first recipients. She spoke eloquently about the importance of supporting those who might otherwise be silenced by fear or intimidation. Her words carried weight because everyone knew she had lived through the experience she was describing. Rick Caldwell attended the ceremony from the back of the gymnasium, his presence generating curious whispers from other attendees. He had requested permission to attend through his therapist, who believed that witnessing Emma's transformation of trauma into triumph would be therapeutic for her former tormentor. Rick sat quietly throughout the proceedings, tears streaming down his face as he listened to Emma speak about forgiveness and second chances. After the ceremony, Rick approached Marcus with obvious nervousness. He asked for a few minutes of private conversation, acknowledging that he had no right to make such a request. Marcus studied the younger man for several long moments before agreeing to walk with him to the school parking lot. Rick looked dramatically different from the arrogant bully who had slapped Emma 8 months earlier. His expensive clothes had been replaced by modest work attire from the nonprofit organization where he now volunteered. His perfectly styled hair was shorter and less carefully maintained. Most importantly, his eyes held a humility and awareness that had been completely absent during their first encounter. Rick began by thanking Marcus for not destroying him completely, though he acknowledged that such mercy hadn't been undeserved. He explained that the past months had been the most difficult and transformative of his life. The therapy sessions had forced him to confront the entitled attitudes and casual cruelty that had defined his personality for years. Marcus listened without interruption as Rick described his work with at-risk youth at the community center. He spoke about teenagers who had faced abuse, neglect, and poverty, problems that made his own privileged upbringing seem almost obscenely comfortable by comparison. Rick admitted that he had initially seen the volunteer work as punishment, but gradually came to understand it as an opportunity for genuine redemption. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, during which Rick demonstrated an understanding of his past behavior that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. He didn't make excuses or seek sympathy, but rather acknowledged the full scope of damage he had caused to multiple families. Rick expressed particular regret for the fear and humiliation Emma had experienced, recognizing that no amount of therapy or community service could undo that harm. Marcus found himself cautiously impressed by the changes in Rick's character and perspective. The transformation wasn't complete. Genuine change required years, not months, but the foundation for meaningful reform appeared to be taking root. Marcus had seen enough broken people during his military service to recognize when someone was truly committed to rebuilding themselves. As their conversation concluded, Rick asked if there was anything else he could do to make amends to the Sullivan family. Marcus's response was characteristically direct. Rick needed to focus on becoming a person worthy of the second chance he had been given, rather than seeking additional validation or forgiveness from his victims. The two men parted with a handshake that acknowledged their shared understanding of justice, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. Marcus drove home knowing that his campaign against the Caldwell family had achieved its ultimate objective, not just punishment, but genuine transformation of the person who had harmed his daughter. Meanwhile, the broader community continued grappling with the systemic changes that Marcus's investigation had triggered. 3 city council members had resigned in disgrace when their financial relationships with the Caldwell family became public. Mayor Patricia Hendricks faced an ongoing federal investigation that would likely end her political career and possibly result in criminal charges. The corruption probe had expanded beyond the Caldwell family to encompass a network of contractors, developers, and political figures who had participated in bid rigging and permit fraud for years. The FBI had established a temporary field office in Millfield to coordinate the investigation, bringing unwanted national attention to what had previously been considered a sleepy coastal community. Local businesses that had competed fairly found themselves benefiting from the level playing field that emerged after the Caldwell family's influence was eliminated. Small contractors who had been systematically excluded from city projects now had opportunities to bid on lucrative infrastructure improvements. Property developers who couldn't afford political donations discovered that their permit applications were being processed based on merit rather than connections. Jennifer Walsh's investigative reporting had earned her a Pulitzer Prize nomination and job offers from major newspapers in Boston and New York. She chose to remain in Millfield, recognizing that her work was far from finished. The corruption she had uncovered represented decades of accumulated abuse that would require years of continued investigation to fully address. Jennifer's articles had inspired other journalists to examine corruption in their own communities, leading to similar investigations in neighboring towns and cities. The Millfield case became a model for how determined individuals and responsible journalists could work together to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. The most significant change in Millfield's political landscape came when Sarah Martinez announced her candidacy for mayor in the upcoming special election. Sarah's daughter had been one of Rick's earliest victims, and her family had suffered economic retaliation for speaking out against the Caldwell family's abuse. Now Sarah was positioned to become the first Hispanic woman to serve as mayor in the town's history. Marcus attended Sarah's campaign announcement at the community center where Rick now volunteered. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The woman whose family had been terrorized by the old power structure was now poised to lead the effort to build something better and more just in its place. Emma's college acceptance letter from Stanford arrived on a crisp December morning, exactly 1 year after the incident at Jefferson's department store. Marcus found her in the kitchen reading the letter with tears of joy streaming down her face. Her dream of studying marine biology at one of the world's premier universities was finally within reach. That evening, Marcus and Emma celebrated at their favorite restaurant, the same place they had gone after every important milestone in her young life. Emma talked excitedly about her future plans and the research opportunities that awaited her in California. Marcus listened with the pride that only a father could feel, knowing that his daughter had emerged from trauma stronger and more determined than ever. Emma also talked about her plans to continue the scholarship fund and her hope that it would grow large enough to help dozens of students pursue their dreams despite difficult circumstances. She had learned that privilege carried responsibility, and that those fortunate enough to overcome adversity had an obligation to help others do the same. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Millfield, Emma thanked her father for everything he had done to protect her and seek justice for their family. Marcus reminded her that she had shown tremendous courage in speaking out publicly about her experience, and that her strength had inspired other victims to find their own voices. The conversation turned to broader questions about justice and accountability. Emma asked whether Marcus ever regretted the methods he had used to bring down the Caldwell family. Marcus considered the question carefully before responding that he regretted the necessity of such extreme measures, but not their implementation. Marcus explained that sometimes peaceful methods were insufficient to address systematic abuse and corruption. The Caldwell family's power had insulated them from normal consequences for their actions, requiring more creative and comprehensive responses. Emma nodded thoughtfully, understanding that her father's military training had equipped him with tools that most people didn't possess. Their house still looked exactly the same from the outside. Yellow paint, small garden, garage where Marcus worked on neighbors' cars. But, inside, both father and daughter had been changed by their experience. Emma was more confident and socially conscious, with a deeper understanding of injustice and the importance of standing up to bullies. Marcus had rediscovered the sense of purpose that had driven him during his military service. That night, Marcus sat in his home office updating the files he had maintained throughout the investigation. The documentation would be preserved indefinitely, serving as both a record of the Caldwell family's crimes and a blueprint for others who might face similar challenges. Marcus had learned that justice sometimes required patience and careful planning rather than immediate confrontation. He also reviewed letters from other parents who had contacted him after reading about Emma's case in the national media coverage. Families from across the country had shared their own stories of children who had been bullied or abused by powerful individuals who seemed untouchable. Marcus had become an unofficial consultant to parents seeking justice for their own children. Most of these cases were resolved through conventional legal channels once the perpetrators realized they were dealing with someone who wouldn't be intimidated or bought off. But a few required more creative approaches, and Marcus had quietly provided guidance to ensure that justice was served even when traditional systems failed. The network of former military personnel that Marcus had cultivated during his years of service proved invaluable for these efforts. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marines, and other elite warriors who had transitioned to civilian life brought their unique skills to bear on behalf of families who had nowhere else to turn. They formed an informal brotherhood dedicated to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Emma's high school graduation approached with the promise of new beginnings for both father and daughter. She would leave for Stanford in the fall, beginning the next chapter of her life with confidence and purpose. Marcus would remain in Millfield, continuing his work as a mechanic while serving as an advocate for justice in his community. The relationship between Marcus and Emma had deepened through their shared experience of trauma and recovery. They had learned to rely on each other completely, understanding that family bonds could overcome any external challenge. Emma knew she could face any obstacle with her father's support, while Marcus had seen his daughter's strength and resilience exceed his highest expectations. The annual Millfield Community Festival took place 3 weeks before Emma's graduation, providing an opportunity for the entire town to celebrate the positive changes that had emerged from a year of difficult revelations. New leadership, reformed institutions, and a renewed commitment to justice had transformed the community's culture and values. Marcus and Emma attended the festival together, enjoying the carnival rides and local food vendors that had been fixtures of the event for decades. But this year felt different. There was a sense of hope and renewal that had been absent during the Caldwell family's reign of intimidation and corruption. Rick Caldwell was also present at the festival, working at a booth that promoted the community center's youth programs. Marcus observed him interacting with teenagers and their families, noting the genuine warmth and respect that characterized these exchanges. The transformation wasn't perfect, but it appeared to be authentic and sustainable. Emma approached Rick's booth during the afternoon, surprising both Marcus and the young man himself. She thanked Rick for his ongoing efforts to make amends and expressed hope that his work with at-risk youth would help prevent other families from experiencing what hers had endured. Rick was visibly moved by her gesture of reconciliation, though both understood that forgiveness was a process rather than a destination. As the festival wound down that evening, Marcus reflected on the year's events and their lasting impact on his family and community. Emma's assault had been a traumatic violation that no parent should have to witness. But the response to that trauma had revealed strengths and capabilities that Marcus hadn't known he possessed in civilian life. The campaign against the Caldwell family had required every skill Marcus had learned during his military service: strategic thinking, operational planning, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare. But it had also demanded qualities that went beyond military training: patience, wisdom, and the moral clarity to distinguish between justice and revenge. Emma's recovery and growth had been equally remarkable. She had transformed a humiliating assault into an opportunity to help others, using her settlement money to create opportunities for deserving students, and her public platform to advocate for victims of bullying and abuse. Marcus couldn't have been more proud of the young woman his daughter was becoming. As they drove home from the festival, Emma talked about her excitement for college and her plans to continue advocating for social justice through her studies and future career. She had decided to double major in marine biology and public policy, hoping to address environmental issues while maintaining her commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. Marcus listened with the satisfaction of a father who knew his most important mission had been accomplished successfully. Emma was prepared for whatever challenges awaited her, equipped with the confidence and values necessary to make a positive impact on the world. The trauma she had experienced would always be part of her story, but it would never define her limitations or diminish her potential. The story of Marcus Sullivan and Emma's assault had become legendary throughout Millfield and beyond, inspiring other families to stand up against abuse and corruption. But, for Marcus, the most important outcome was much simpler. His daughter knew she was loved, protected, and capable of overcoming any obstacle life might present. Years later, when Emma had become a successful marine biologist and advocate for environmental justice, she would tell her own children about the time their grandfather showed an entire community what it meant to protect family and seek justice. The lesson would live on through future generations, ensuring that the values Marcus had fought to defend would never be forgotten or abandoned. And, in his workshop late at night, Marcus Sullivan continued fixing broken engines and broken lives, secure in the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost, and that love for family could overcome any enemy or obstacle. The quiet coastal town of Millfield slept peacefully, protected by a man who had never forgotten his oath to defend those who couldn't defend themselves.